It is one of the most witnessed births in the whole of European history, and it convinced almost nobody. The baby was James Francis Edward Stuart, and his father was a Catholic king sitting one death away from handing England to Rome for good. That is the piece that gets lost. This was never a squabble about paternity. A living, breathing male heir of the wrong religion was, to a large slice of the country, a national emergency in a christening gown. Here is where and when it happened. St James's Palace, London, the morning of the 10th of June, 1688, somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock. Mary of Modena, the Queen, said she was cold. Someone brought in a warming pan. If you have never seen one, it is a metal pan on a long handle. You fill it with hot coals and slide it between the sheets to take the chill off a bed before you climb in. Boring. Domestic. The dullest object in the room by a mile. Inside of 5 months it would be the most notorious prop in the country, and it would help push a king off his throne. So let me tell you why a baby drove a nation slightly insane, and why the more people who swore they saw it born, the less anyone believed them. Start with James. James, Duke of York, brother to Charles II, had married a commoner first. Anne Hyde gave him 2 daughters, who lived, Mary and Anne, and both girls were raised Protestant on Charles's orders, whatever their father's private drift toward Rome. James converted to Catholicism somewhere around 1668. When Anne Hyde died in 1671, he went looking for a Catholic bride and found a 15-year-old Italian princess, Mary of Modena, married to him by proxy in 1673 when he was 39. Parliament was so angry, it talked about annulling the match on the spot. Charles II had to suspend Parliament to keep the marriage alive. You have to understand how frightened Protestant England was of Catholic power in these years. The same year James married Mary, Parliament passed the Test Act to shove Catholics out of public office. In 1678, a serial liar named Titus Oates invented a Jesuit plot to murder the king. The whole thing was fiction, and the country lost its mind anyway. Then came the long fight to bar James from the throne by law, which split the political class into the 2 camps we still half recognise today, the pro-exclusion Whigs and the pro-hereditary Tories. There had even been a Protestant alternative waiting in the wings. During those years, the men pushing hardest to exclude James, led by the Earl of Shaftesbury, had a candidate ready, Charles II's illegitimate but reliably Protestant son, the Duke of Monmouth. That plan collapsed. Charles dissolved Parliament rather than let the exclusion bill pass, and Monmouth's own armed rising after James took the throne ended with his head on a block. So by 1688 the Protestants had already tried the legal route and the military route and lost both. A newborn Catholic prince told them the last option. The patient one had failed too. Because that is what they had been doing. Waiting. James became king in 1685, and Protestants made an uneasy peace with it through one cold calculation. He was aging. His only surviving children were his 2 Protestant daughters, and when he died the crown would slide safely back to them. His reign was a Catholic pause. Annoying, temporary, survivable. You just had to outlast him. A son broke the arithmetic. A Catholic boy shoved Mary and Anne down the line and turned the pause into a dynasty, a Catholic England stretching out with no visible end. Exactly the future that decades of test acts and exclusion fights had been built to prevent. That is why the pregnancy landed like a threat rather than good news, and this particular queen getting pregnant strained belief for reasons that had nothing to do with propaganda. Mary of Modena's history of trying to produce an heir is hard to read. A daughter, Catherine Laura, born in 1675, dead the same year of convulsions. Isabel, who made it to 4, a son, Charles, carried off by smallpox. Charlotte Maria, 3 weeks old when convulsions killed her. Stillbirth after stillbirth stacked in between across the late 1670s and early 1680s. By the spring of 1688, she was 29, roughly 15 years married, and she had buried every child she bore. She had visited the therapeutic waters at Bath, and not long after, late in 1687, she was pregnant again. To a suspicious public doing cruel arithmetic, a healthy child arriving now, after all of that, looked less like a miracle and more like a setup. Then she made the one decision that poured petrol on the whole thing. There was a custom for royal pregnancies, and it was not a gentle one. The Queen's body was semi-public property. Her belly, her bed linen, even her breasts were meant to be available for inspection, so that respectable witnesses could confirm the pregnancy was real and moving along. Mary refused. Some of it was personal modesty, some of it Catholic reserve, but the effect was identical whatever the reason. She left an empty space where the proof was supposed to sit, and rumour is very good at filling empty spaces. One pamphlet argued flatly that she could not really be pregnant given her poor health, and pointed out she had not even lactated. So the false belly story was born. She was padding herself out. The whisper went, faking the bump, and when the time came she would produce a stranger's baby and call it a prince. Her own stepdaughter half believed it. Princess Anne, James's younger Protestant daughter, spent the pregnancy writing to her sister Mary over in Holland, and Mary was married to William of Orange, which is a detail worth holding on to. Anne poked at the pregnancy in letter after letter. In her most quoted line, she allowed that the child might possibly be the Queen's, then added that where one person believed that, 1,000 did not. Those letters mattered. They helped nudge Mary of Orange, sitting in The Hague, toward backing what her husband was about to do. And Anne, at the actual moment of birth, was nowhere near St James's. She was at Bath, taking the waters herself, out of town on the one morning her presence would have settled everything. She wrote afterward that she was so unlucky to have been away when the Queen was brought to bed, because now she would never be satisfied whether the child was true or false. Conspiracy-minded people have chewed on that absence for 3 centuries. I think the dull explanation is probably the right one. The Labour seems to have moved fast, and nobody may have thought to drag the King's suspicious daughter back from a spa in time, but you can see how it looked. Now the birth itself, and here is the strange heart of the whole affair. This was not some hidden delivery behind a locked door. The room was jammed. Estimates run from 42 people crowded in at the moment of labour up to more than 70 who at one point or another gave witness. The Queen Dowager, Catherine of Braganza, was there. Most of the Privy Council was there. Ladies-in-waiting, physicians, courtiers, all breathing the same close air. The London Gazette put out the official notice that morning that between 9 and 10 the Queen had been safely delivered of a prince at St James's, with His Majesty, the Queen Dowager, most of the lords of the Privy Council, and various ladies of quality present. If you wanted to fake a birth, this is the worst possible way to do it. You do not smuggle a substitute infant into a room containing dozens of the most important people in the kingdom, half of them squinting at you already, primed to catch you doing exactly this. The plan the rumour describes is almost comically impossible. And yet, the warming pan is where all of it converged. The story that formed around it took hold fast, and it went like this. The Queen's real baby had been born dead, or was never real at all, and a healthy substitute, usually described as some commoner's son, in the nastier Dutch version a miller's baby, had been carried into the royal bed hidden inside that long-handled brass pan, and then presented to the world as the Prince of Wales. Sit with the physical claim for a second, because it is the part I like best. A full-term newborn, inside a warming pan. A warming pan is a shallow dish built to hold coals and skim under bedsheets. The historian Elizabeth Norton went and looked at the surviving birthbed and its warming pan at Hampton Court, put her eyes on the real objects, and her verdict was that you would need an impossibly tiny baby to fit one inside the other. The thing barely holds a decent load of hot coal. You're not folding a living newborn into it and strolling past a room full of witnesses. The conspiracy dies the instant you measure the props. So where did such a specific weird detail even come from? Probably from something true and completely innocent. One account traces the whole warming pan image back to the testimony of a midwife, Margaret Dawson, who mentioned that an ordinary warming pan had been used around the Queen's bed during the labour to keep her warm because, again, she was cold. That is the seed. A real object doing its real job, mentioned by an honest witness, and then the Williamite propaganda machine grew a coup out of it. The best fake news usually starts with a true detail bent at the joint, and it was a machine. I want to be clear about that, because there is a lazy version of this story, where the rumour simply bubbles up out of the frightened masses. It did not. It was helped along by professionals. James Johnston, an agent working for William of Orange, is credited with pushing William to quietly sponsor a pamphlet that fed the birth rumours. The Immortal Seven, the group of English nobles who formally wrote to William and invited him to invade, folded doubts about the baby straight into their invitation. and out of the Dutch print shops came the satire. There is a mezzotint attributed to Peter Schenk from 1688 that parodies the official birth announcements, and it is a sharp piece of black propaganda. In the baby's cradle, a little toy windmill, so you cannot miss the joke that this is the miller's boy. And hovering suggestively near the Queen, a Jesuit priest. That priest is a whole second conspiracy running alongside the first. Father Edward Petre was the King's Jesuit confessor, and a parallel rumour insisted he was the Queen's lover, that he, and not James, had fathered the child. So depending on which pamphlet you picked up in London that autumn, the baby was either a stranger smuggled in via kitchenware, or the illegitimate son of a scheming priest, or somehow both at once. Coherence was not the point. Volume was the point. You throw enough versions at a nervous public and something sticks to the wall. James tried to fight it the way a 17th century king would, with sworn testimony. On the 22nd of October, 1688, he called an extraordinary meeting of the Privy Council at Whitehall and had the people who had been in the room testify one after another to what they had seen. The same witnesses, formally deposed one after another, their accounts registered in Chancery, so the record would be permanent and official. In a calmer moment it would have been overwhelming. Dozens of respectable people under oath describing the same birth. It did almost nothing. Worse, it may have backfired. Think about how it reads to a public already sure there was a fix. A king who has to gather that many sworn statements to prove his own son is real does not look like a man with nothing to hide. He looks like a man building an alibi. And the witnesses were mostly Catholic, or courtiers bound tightly to the king, exactly the people a suspicious Protestant would trust least. The proof was solid. The audience had already decided not to accept proof from that source. The timing finished it off. By the day those depositions were registered, William of Orange's invasion fleet had already put to sea. The inquiry was reading its verdict into an empty courtroom, while the real verdict was sailing across the Channel. On the 5th of November, 1688, William landed at Torbay. Whatever those courtiers had sworn in Chancery no longer mattered in the slightest. Here is the thing that the propaganda's own success hides. William did not need the warming pan. He had a cleaner claim sitting right there. His wife Mary and her sister Anne were Protestants and by any reading the rightful heirs, and if you simply argued that a Catholic succession was intolerable, you had a serious case without a single word about smuggled infants. The changeling story was never the load-bearing wall, it was the paint. It let an armed invasion by a foreign prince wear the costume of a rescue, a defence of the true succession against a fraud, rather than what it more nakedly was, a grab for a crown. That is why it got sponsored and printed and pushed. Not because William's lawyers needed it, because his image did. After that, it moves quickly. In December, Mary of Modena slipped out of London in disguise. One account has her dressed as a laundress, carrying the infant prince, and crossed to France. James sent them ahead of him. Then James himself bolted, botched his first escape, got intercepted, and finally made it across before the year was out. In February 1689, the Convention Parliament decided that a king running away counted as abdicating, and handed the throne jointly to William and Mary. By the end of that year, the Bill of Rights spelled out the lesson England had drawn from all of it in plain law. No Catholic could sit on the throne, no monarch could even marry one. The baby whose birth everyone had watched was written out of the succession, not by rumour now, but by statute. They went further in 1701 with the Act of Settlement, which reaffirmed the ban and is the whole reason that, when Anne died in 1714, the crown vaulted clean over dozens of Catholic relatives with closer blood claims and landed on a German Protestant, George of Hanover, who barely spoke English. That is how badly they wanted no more Catholic kings. They would import one who needed a translator rather than risk it. There is a bitter family note running under all the statecraft. Both of James's daughters had turned on him. Mary sat on his throne now beside her husband, and Anne had spent the pregnancy feeding doubt across the Channel to Holland. James reportedly complained that his ungrateful daughters had broken the commandment to honour their father. He was a difficult man and a worse king, but on that narrow point he had a case. His own children had helped write him out of the succession, which leaves the baby. What happened to James Francis Edward Stuart, the infant at the centre of all of it? He got a long, strange, mostly sad life as the king who never was. Louis XIV gave the exiled family a chateau at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and when James II died in 1701, Louis stood up and declared the 13-year-old boy King of England, James III. France recognised him. So did Spain, the Papal States, and Modena. Britain did not, and the English Parliament attainted him for treason the following year, which is the formal way of marking a man a traitor to a throne he had never sat on. He spent decades as a claimant, and the Jacobite cause spent decades throwing itself at Britain on his behalf and losing. In 1708, a French fleet carried him towards Scotland and got chased off by the Royal Navy under Admiral Byng, with the weather finishing the job before he could even land. In 1715 came the big one, the rising they called the 15, led by the Earl of Mar. It stalled badly. The Battle of Sheriff Muir settled nothing. The Jacobites lost at Preston, and by the time James himself landed at Peterhead late that December, the whole thing was already collapsing. He came down with a fever, failed to light any fire under the men who were left, and was back in France by February. In 1719 the Spanish backed another go, the 19, which the weather again broke apart into a handful of pointless Highland skirmishes. He settled at last in Rome, under the Pope's protection at the Palazzo Muti, and his court in exile turned into a fixed stop on the Grand Tour, a slightly melancholy tourist attraction where British travellers could go and look at the king their country had refused. He married a Polish princess, Maria Clementina Sobieska, and had 2 sons. The elder was Charles Edward Stuart, the one history remembers as Bonnie Prince Charlie. The younger, Henry Benedict, went the other direction entirely and became a Catholic cardinal, which infuriated Charles, who understood correctly that a cardinal in the family was not much of a selling point for a Protestant restoration. Charles is the one who came closest, and it is still not close. In 1745 he landed in the Hebrides, raised his father's standard in August, won some early fights, and pushed a Highland army deep enough into the argument that people in London worried in earnest. Then, on the 16th of April, 1746, government troops under the Duke of Cumberland caught the Jacobites on Culloden Moor and broke them for good. That was the end. Not just of the 45, but of the whole serious project of putting a Stuart back. The father outlived the dream by 20 years. James Francis Edward died in Rome on the 1st of January, 1766, 77 years old, and here is the footnote I cannot get over. Counting from the day his own father died and the Jacobites first proclaimed him king, his phantom reign ran 64 years. That is longer than any real British monarch had ever managed, and it held as the record until Elizabeth II passed it in 2016. A man who never ruled anything held the crown, on paper, in the loyalty of his followers, longer than nearly every king and queen who actually sat on the throne. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, and both his sons ended up beside him. There are 2 more graves worth standing at because they twist the knife. Mary of Modena, the queen accused of faking a pregnancy and smuggling in a changeling, spent her exile being adored. At the French court she was treated almost as a saint. The diarist Madame de Sévigné admired her bearing and her quick wit, and thought James himself a bore. None of it spared her a bleak end. She lost another child, her daughter Louisa Maria, to smallpox in 1713. The Treaty of Utrecht that same year forced her to watch her son expelled from France altogether. She died in 1718 of breast cancer, living in something close to poverty in a convent near Saint-Germain. The woman half of England, pictured as a scheming Italian conspirator, died broke, bereaved, and mourned mostly by foreigners. James got a stranger afterlife still. He died in 1701, and almost at once people began reporting miracles at his tomb. In 1734, the Archbishop of Paris heard evidence toward making him a saint. A deposed king, run out of his own country under a fog of conspiracy, was seriously floated for canonization within a generation of his death. Nothing came of it, and then the French Revolution came for his tomb and destroyed his body, which is about as final as indignities get. And the warming pan would not die either. 60 years after the birth, in the middle of the 1745 Rising, people were still tossing the changeling story around as a way to paint the Stuart claim as fraudulent from its very first breath. It had stopped being anything anyone needed to believe and become a reliable insult, a piece of political furniture you could pick up whenever a Jacobite got ambitious. The scandal left one hard, permanent mark, and it is still there. The rule that a Catholic cannot inherit the British crown and that the sovereign cannot marry one comes straight out of this panic, and the two acts that carried it stayed load-bearing in the succession for centuries. All of it sits on top of a birth that more than 40 people watched happen. The most suspicious birth in royal history was one of the least secret events of its age, witnessed, sworn to, registered in chancery, and disbelieved anyway, because the country had already decided what it needed to be true. And the baby at the bottom of it outlasted, in title if never in fact, almost every monarch who was ever crowned.